My name is Bart Nyssen. I'm the chair of the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, and I want to welcome you all to the Daniel L. and Irma Evans Lecture in Civil and Environmental Engineering. The lectureship was endowed by Dan, Roger, and Robert Evans to memorialize and honor the human and broad societal outlook of their parents. The lectureship provides an opportunity to deepen the understanding of engineering by exposing students and practicing engineers to the concepts, challenges, concerns, and methods they will use throughout their career. Daniel Lester Evans received his engineering degree with honors from our department in 1917 and served for a long time in engineering positions in the Seattle area, including as King County Chief Engineer. A special welcome to the members of the Evans family who have made this lecture possible. It is a great privilege to have you with us after the past few years, during which public gatherings were severely limited. Before I introduce the speaker and give him the floor, I have the opportunity to share a special announcement on behalf of the Civil and Environmental Engineering faculty. Our department has recently started the annual tradition of celebrating one of our own alumni with a Distinguished Alumni Award. The award acknowledges the achievements of departmental alumni and highlights how civil and environmental engineering degrees create meaningful impact. I am honored to present the 2023 Distinguished Alumni Award to the Honorable Daniel Jackson Evans, class of 48 and 49, who, like his father, graduated from our department. After leaving the UW and Moore Hall, which was brand spanking new at the time, Dan went on to become one of the most distinguished leaders in the history of Washington State. A few years after graduation, during which time he worked as a civil engineer in Seattle, Dan was elected to the Washington State Legislature, followed by 3 terms as Washington State Governor from 65 to 77. He then served as the president of the Evergreen State College in Olympia, and went on to the other Washington as a U.S. Senator from 83 to 89. After retiring from politics, he served for 12 years on the UW Board of Regents. Perhaps more than the positions, what we should be celebrating are Dan's accomplishments. There are many, but time is short and you did not come here to listen to me. Given that May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, I simply want to highlight that as governor, Dan Evans welcomed refugees from Vietnam to settle in Washington State during a time when such a decision was controversial. An initiative for which he received the 2018 Margaret Chase Smith American Democracy Award. Dan has demonstrated a lifelong commitment to public service. He has long-standing ties to the University of Washington and extraordinary experience in the fields of governance, education, and the environment. We are immensely proud to count Dan as one of our own. In his autobiography, Dan knows that I love being an engineer. It's a profession where precision, problem solving, and teamwork matter. Thank you, Dan, for all your service to the broader community and the UW, and for your role in making this lecture possible. Which brings us back to today's lecture. It is truly my great honor to introduce Rafael, who holds the K. Harrison Brown Family Chair and is professor in Civil and Environmental Engineering and in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Professor Brass has a long and illustrious career in hydrology and in academic leadership. He was provost and executive vice president for academic affairs at Georgia Tech, distinguished professor and dean of engineering at UC Irvine, and professor and chair at MIT. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's been awarded about every possible honor in the areas of hydrology and engineering. I strongly encourage you to take a look at his blog and newsletter about academic leadership. Today, Professor Brass will discuss a very large and at times controversial engineering project that contains all the elements of a compelling story: innovative and creative engineering, political intrigue and scandal, and ultimately triumph and vindication for the design. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brass.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Governor and Senator Evans, I read a little bit about your life. And I wish that we had more people like you in present government. One of the things I read which really struck me was in 1988, you were quoted as saying that you were disappointed with the bickering and the protracted paralysis in government. I just wonder what you think about it now. But anyway, it's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for doing this for the university, and thank you for inviting me. This talk is a story, it's really a personal story of one of the most amazing public infrastructure projects in recent history. It is a story about saving one of the oldest and most beautiful and extraordinary cities in the world. It is a story of extraordinary creativity. It is a story of politics. It is a story of driven individuals. It is a story of ethical failures and corruption. But ultimately, it is a story of success and vindication of the extraordinary engineering by extraordinary Italian professionals. The city of Venice is located in the northern Adriatic, in the northeast of Italy. It consists of over 100 very small islands connected by bridges. There are no cars in Venice. It is the ultimate pedestrian city. The city is over 1,200 years old. It is at its present location. It was founded by people moving to the northern part of from the northern part of the lagoon, running away from attacks by the Huns around 452 AD. Continuing attacks led the settlements further south in what is now the city. By the 1400s, Venice was the most powerful city-state in the Adriatic and the Mediterranean. The lagoon, which is about 50 kilometers long and about 11 kilometers wide and oriented north-south, was the extraordinary safe harbor of this naval power. But they had a problem. Left to nature, the lagoon would ultimately become a marsh, dominated by shallow water. It still looks that way in some of the margins, particularly in the northern edges. Such a lagoon would have been a national security threat to an exclusively naval power. But the Venetians were great engineers, and sedimentation of their lagoon was not going to threaten their national security. They proceeded to divert all the rivers that went into the lagoon. Prominent are the Brenta in the southern part of the lagoon, and this diagram in particular is oriented north is that way, south is this way, and this is the Brenta. And the Sive that goes that way, as shown in this 16th century map. The end result of that diversion is that the lagoon receives very, very little sediment. A lot of the sediment that used to go into the lagoon never gets there now. That's the 20th century lagoon. That's the lagoon of Venice as we know it. Something that I want to emphasize and had a lot of implications, many political, during this project. The Lagoon of Venice is a completely engineered environment. There's really very little left that is natural. The rivers were diverted, a navigation canal was dredged from the entrance of Malamocco, and you sort of see it a little bit here as you go around, and then you would go to this area here, which is Marghera, which I will talk about later, that allows tankers, industrial tankers carrying all sorts of things, to move into that industrial place. The Malamocco Central Inlet is where I chose this industrial part. Then there's the Lido Inlet, this is Venice, in the northern part. And then there's Chioggia Inlet, which, whoops, my apologies, which is in the south and is right next to a little city that is a fishing village. All this has been stabilized by seawalls, by levees, all completely engineered structures. If you look in the northern part of the Lido Inlet, this whole municipality that is called Cavallino wasn't there in the 1600 map. In fact, it is the sediment accumulated behind this levee that the Venetians built hundreds of years ago that created that land. There's seawalls that go along all this region, and we're going to refer to them later. This is the Palestrina seawall area. Again, was built by the Venetians. The end result of all these efforts is that the Lagoon of Venice shifted from a wetland to what is really and truly a marine environment. It is very different from what it would have been. Rather than marshes and a myriad of islands, basically what you have, so rather than the above, what you have is a deeper bowl-shaped lagoon, which is quite salty. The salt marshes and small islands have really eroded and are now a very small part of the lagoon. The lagoon is very much, as I said, a marine environment with increased salinity and significant tidal exchanges with the ocean. The lagoon exports sediment to the tune of 700,000 cubic meters a year. On November 4th, 1966, there was a wake-up call to Venice and all of Italy. A high tide, and I will define that later, was recorded at a historical maximum of 1.92 meters above the reference level at Punta Salute, which is near the Grand Canal in Venice, in front of Piazza San Marco. All of Venice, Chioggia, and the surrounding regions were flooded. San Marco, the famous San Marco, which are the bottom pictures in here, was completely flooded with over 1 meter of water. The seawalls were breached, and it really endangered the integrity of the lagoon. If it had gone through, the sea would have taken over and all freshwater signs would be lost. If you know a little bit of Venice, so to locate yourself, this is the Doge Palace, or the Ducal Palace, depending on what language you use, and the cathedral, which you'll see a picture later, is to the left of that. What causes these things? These are storms and tides that effectively result from a combination of the astronomical tide, but really a setup of wind, either from the north, the Bora, or the south, the Sirocco winds, that lead to the flooding of the lagoon. So the Adriatic rises with the setup of the wind, and that goes into the lagoon, and the lagoon rises. These events traditionally have largely occurred between October and March of every year, which is the stormy period in a Mediterranean climate, and so in the Mediterranean. The high tides continued to this day. These are pictures, not of 1966, but of recent time. The events are increasingly common, as will be discussed later. At times of flooding, the historical places like the Plaza San Marco and the cathedral are completely full of water. The damage to infrastructure is extraordinary. Commerce stops. Venice is a difficult city to live in, and flooding makes it much harder. All the first floors of one of the most expensive real estates in the world are flooded and wasted. Today, at its glory, Venice had something like 250,000 inhabitants. Today, there are maybe, I don't think it reaches 70,000, so a fourth of what it used to be, more or less, that live there permanently. Common people simply cannot afford to live in Venice, and it's just hard. The youth leaves. The real estate is controlled by absentee owners. Business outside of that serving tourism and managed by mainlanders, as they call it, are not easily established. Young people simply do not want to stay, and there are few options for them. What caused this flooding, or what causes this flooding? Well, it has always been some flooding in Venice for time immemorial. But as I will show you, it has increased. One of the reasons is, well, there are two main reasons. One, which is subsidence, which I will address, or the sinking of the lagoon. Much of the sinking resulted, I should say, from the pumping of fresh water in the industrial region of Marghera. After First World War, that location was settled as a need for industries, and after Second World War, it saw a tremendous growth in heavy industries, like particularly refineries and shipbuilding and dry docks. The water needed for these activities came from tapping the deep aquifers under the lagoon. After 1966, and investigations indicated that the pumping had resulted in significant subsidence. Close to 14 centimeters of relative sea level have been lost due to the pumping in the industrial site. In 1969, the subsidence profile, what you have is loss sinking, if you want to think that way in common terms, in here in centimeters, and this is the profile across the lagoon, cutting from Venice all the way to the mainland through Mestre. And what you see in 1969, that was the profile. In 1970, once they realized that this pumping was creating problems, they stopped pumping. And the end result was that you saw a rebound. So in 1975, the ground level is higher up. And so similarly, the pisometric heads change from 52 to 75 to 69, or 69 to 75, you see it going up. But like good engineers will know, it never rebounds to the original level. That's what hysteresis is all about. So in essence, you have lost, because of the sinking, on the order of tens of centimeters of relative sea level, about 14. But that's not all. It goes far beyond the sinking. This graph tells a real story. The sea level has been rising in the Adriatic since early 20th century, like almost everywhere else in the planet. The rate of sea level rise is at least on the order of 1.5 millimeters a year and probably accelerating. The blue wedge in the figure shows the sea level rise since the 1900s. So you see this illustrated as almost a straight line going straight up. As the figure shows, this sea level rise is accounting for of another 12 centimeters of loss, of equivalent loss of ground, if I can put it that way. The combined process of subsidence in the bottom, sinking, and sea level rise add up to about 26 centimeters of relative to sea level loss. So between sinking and sea level rising, if you are sitting in Venice, it looks like you're 26 centimeters deeper. Notice, by the way, which is interesting for the engineers in the crowd, that in 1970, when they stopped the pumping, the rate of subsidence that was going very accelerated rate in here, you see how deep, how fast it was going down, bounced back and then started going very much along this similar slope as this yellow wedge, which is the natural subsidence, and that's about 0.4 millimeters a year. Sea level rise is the dominant factor now in creating the floods in Venice and going forward to the future. The location sinks naturally, but it sinks at a rate which is about less than 25% or less of the sea level rise effect. The end result of that is that the city floods more thoroughly and more often. So this is on the beginning of at the turn of the 20th century, this is what the city of Venice would have flooded at a level of 100 centimeters above the datum in Punta Salute. At a level of 120, you see at a 120, San Marco, which is that area there, would have flooded. That's the lowest point in Venice. And then at 140, you would have all the light blue that you see there. Now, at 100, you certainly flood San Marco. So before you were flooding San Marco at 120. And basically the whole city is flooded with 140 centimeters of tide, of this high tide. Remember that the 1966 flood was 1.92, so 2 meters of flooding. The amount, another way of looking at it, which is quite interesting, is look at the frequency of events also. So if we plot here centimeters above the zero gauge, above the reference level, in 1908, that black line was the level of the city. Presently, you have lost about 26 centimeters of relative sea level, and the rate of loss is this red line going down, and this is years from 1910 to 2020. What you observe two things. Clearly, since you are lower, you exceed the level of the city with lower floods, with smaller floods. But also evident is that the number of floods have increased significantly. So you have more floods and more flooding, and you have to deal with both of those. So the whole idea then was come up with a protection strategy for this situation. And I think the existential question for the Venetians and Italy was, do you just let the city ultimately be flooded all the time and disappear, or do you do something about it? Well, they decided to do something about it. And there was a political process that took a long, long time. Remember, the major flood that triggered a lot of this was in 1966. In 1984, there was a special law created that created something called the Comitatone, which is a council of ministers headed by the prime minister to come up with solutions for the problem of Venice. Then in 1994, they created an entity which is called the Consorcio Venezia Nuova, with the mandate of come up with a solution for Venice. That concept, in many ways, made a lot of sense. I did not get involved until 1995. At that point, they had decided they were going to go ahead. They had had some preliminary competitions of designs run by the Consortia Venezia Nova, and they wanted an environmental impact statement. And I was asked to help create a panel of international experts to oversee the environmental impact statement, which was done. There were other panels, including a panel of other international experts looking at the whole concept. The creation of CVN, of the Consortia Venezia Nova, in many ways is what made this possible, and in many ways is what made this difficult. CVN is a private company with the right and the mandate to solve the problem of Venice, of the lagoon of Venice. It has public oversight. Originally, that public oversight is through an entity that is called the Magistrato alla Acqua, which is an entity that has been in place since 16th century. The Magistrato, that office, had to approve all interventions, the designs and construction. And that's important to remember. CVN is owned by shareholders which were or are the largest construction and engineering firms in Italy, about 50 of them, with the larger construction companies holding the controlling shares. This construct, in many ways, is brilliant because it brought in the private sector and the private sector efficiency and really fantastic Italian engineering. It could act on its own, including arranging for financing, but always relying, and there's another weak point in the process, on the central government annual budgetary process for the allocation of the resources. So every year you depended on the main government allocating the resources that would allow CVN to continue. They could do short-term financing, but in the long term they depended on that annual process. Another advantage is that CVN operated above a lot of the bureaucracy and red tape. One flaw, though, is that it relied on an entity, the Magistrato, that really did not have the bandwidth to act promptly and knowledgeably in the approval of the elements of a very complex project. That resulted in constant pressures and conflict. Yet another flaw is that CVN had to operate under the thumb of very powerful board of directors that had self-interest and at times conflicting interests in completing the elements of the billionaire project. By the time I came in the picture, a preliminary design of the flood control activities of the tidal barriers existed. CVN had to get the approval of the environmental impact assessment to do the final design and go into construction. In fact, a lot of work, as I'll show later, had been done over the previous 10 years, up to the tune of $100 million a year, to give you a sense of how much was this. Other panels were involved. They reported favorably in the project, so did we. And then I was asked to stay on and create another panel to oversee the actual implementation and construction of the process. When you think of what was done, the strategy to protect the city had two elements to it. One is what I could call the passive protection. Passive protection is, let's do things that will minimize flooding up to a certain level of flood. And that level was about 110 centimeters originally. That was the thought. And it included, for example, creating whole new beaches with groins that were under the water. And anybody has tried to do this. These are massive operations. And you have to import all the sand and creating these beaches to protect the original Venetian islands, barrier islands, and this is the original wall that the Venetians built and almost was breached in 1966. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by the time in 1995 this came about. Another passive protection is the building of raising the pavements in the canals so that they would protect the city to the level of 110 and in some places 120 centimeters. That works, but it works only in some places because there's a limit to how much you can raise the pavement before you have to sort of bend down to go through the door. So it's a difficult issue, and furthermore, you're not going to do this in the historical center of the city because you want to protect that architecture. So you're not going to do this. You can do this in the surrounding areas of the historical center. So but a lot of pavements were rebuilt from looking like this to looking like that actually prevents flooding significantly up to, in places, up to 120 centimeters. That's the passive protection. Then comes the active protection. The active protection is a system of barriers. And Venice, in many ways, because of the engineering of the Venetians, lends itself to this solution. It lends itself because it has three very well-defined inlets. To repeat what I showed you earlier, now oriented north-south, Boca de Lido. This is a famous place. Anybody who ever read Death in Venice, it occurred there in the Lido. Malamoco, which is the industrial entrance. Remember the canal that cut through there and went through there to here, that's Marghera. And the Chioggia, which is the city of Chioggia, the fishing village, and a lot of traffic of water, of small vessels go through here. There are large tankers that go through here, and there are very large passenger ships that go through Lido quite often. Now, so the location is easy, and the idea was this active protection is intended to kick on whenever you predict or expect a flood that is larger than that the passive protection can handle. So if you remember the numbers I told you, if you predict more than 110 centimeters of tide, the barriers kick in. That's the theory. Because the passive protection cannot handle it on its own. And why to do that? Because you cannot keep closing and opening these things for the smaller things. Otherwise, you're going to be closing and opening all the time, and that affects traffic, and it's a serious issue in many other ways. So you have the inlets, you know where to put the barriers, so the big question was, how should they look? Well, building tidal barriers to protect flooding against flooding is really not a new idea at all. It has existed in many places and for many years all around the world. The barriers of Rotterdam, I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. In the picture that I showed there, that's Rotterdam, protects that port and the surroundings from the North Sea. They consist of segments of circles that rotate around a point. So these segments rotate around that point. This is the barriers closing the inlet. Normally, the gates sit on land on the side. So you would put them in here, and you call on them when there's a flood coming. To give you a sense of size of the things, I don't know if you see this little red thing there. That's a locomotive. All right, that's what moves the gates in and out. It literally just pushes them in, pushes them out. And the way that they do it is, and this is interesting because we're going to do the inverse, when it is time to take them out, if they're in, they pump air in, these things sort of float out in the hinge, and then they push them back into the land. And when they want to put them back in place to close the inlet, they will push them in, they would flood them, and they would sink and close off the inlet. Effective, simple, clean, consumes a lot of land, and they're ugly. That's an important factor if you're working in Italy. It's very, very important. The Thames, I'm sure many of you have been in London. I don't know whether you've had a chance to go and see it. By the way, I was there just a month ago, and now there's an Uber boat that takes you all the way to the barriers if you want to go. It's really a fantastic concept. But those are the barriers in the Thames. Now, as you can see, they're fixed structures they stick out. They close off with sort of these semicircles that come in and out of the water. And when they come out, they will protect London, which is way up here, from flooding in the North Sea. Yeah. Again, they're out there. Again, there's no way you're going to put a tanker through that. So there's no ability to continue the commerce that would otherwise occur, let's say, in a place like Venice. So the development of the Venice design had to started with several implicit and explicit statements of some things it had to satisfy. The barriers should be as unobtrusive as possible. The navigation in and out of the lagoon should not be significantly interrupted or impacted. Tidal exchanges should be maintained. There must be minimal changes to the inlet's cross-section and the water velocity profiles. If you know hydraulics, that's quite a challenge to do it. Land should be protected. There's not much land to put this Rotterdam Lakes Gates type stuff. And the solution must work within the inlet's width that vary in size. They're less than about half a kilometer to a kilometer and of different depth. And finally, let me add, they don't want to see them. Again, this is Italy, all right? You don't want this, certainly not near Venice. So they want to make it as unobtrusive, as invisible as possible. The result, though, was truly imaginative in many ways, not only satisfying all those conditions, but really and truly using very wise engineering from a structural perspective, but unquestionably very, very challenging. So let me show you quickly how, this is a schematic, this is not the real thing. So what you have in a theoretical inlet, you would have some protection. This is the Adriatic, that's the lagoon up there. And what you see there, this is the position when the gates are in operation. So the Adriatic is in this place and the lagoon is on the other side. In this cut section here, what you see is a picture. You have these flaps that would, when in operation, will rise, keep the sea higher than the lagoon. Each of these flaps are hinged in only one place. And each of those flaps is independent to move. So they're not tied to each other. They can move. And each of those flaps are enormous, as I will show you in a second. So that looks that way. Whoops. And this is an illustration of how it would work. Most of the time, you would have these flaps or gates sitting, sleeping in their cradle, like this. When a flood comes, you pump air in, they rotate around the hinge. The sea rises on this side, the lagoon stays the same level. When you're done with them, you put the water back in, and they go back to sleep down there. And you can drive your tanker above anytime you want, and it's invisible. So that's the design. As I said, that is a challenging design, but from an engineering perspective, incredibly efficient. For two reasons. It's only hinged at one location. It allows movement, so you don't have to create a stiff structure that will require a massive structural buildup to handle the forces. And you allow each flap to move independently. Because if you tight them, again, you create a rigid structure that will be very, very difficult to build. And handles the efficiency of pumping water in and out quite well. Give you a sense of scale. That is the way it looks in a schematic. Here are the gates. Here are all the galleries that you can go in. The gate is literally hinged in there with an enormous hinge, but it is like a regular hinge. It pulls down, you turn it, and that's it. And it holds it in place. But then, to put it again in perspective, that's a person walking in there. To give you a sense of the size. A good sense of scale of the inlet's characteristics. You have actually, it turns out, as you will see, that there are three inlets, but the Lido inlet is 1 kilometer wide. So it was broken in two sections, the northern Lido and the southern Lido, each about 0.5 kilometer wide. And the others are about 0.5 kilometer wide. So each of them is of different depth. So you will see that the caissons that hold these gates, for example, Lido has 7 interior caissons and 2 shoulder caissons that go underwater. Each of those caissons weighs 13,000 tons. Each of them is 60 meters by 36 meters by 8.7 meters tall. These things are enormous. They are buildings, right? And on top of that, you're going to put the gates. This is the cradle that I referred to, right? You're building these cradles. These are and the gates go hinge on each of those things, and you'll see them in a second. In Malamoco, different, much heavier ones, 22,500, is a lot deeper. In Malamoco, that's where the tankers got. Lido South is a little bigger than Lido North, and Kioja, again, a little heavier, deeper port area. So this is an illustration during construction of how this looked. This is the Lido Inlet, and what you see, the amount of work that went into here, a lot of it underwater, but this is an artificial island that was built to divide the Lido Inlet in two sections that you would close off. So if you probably see a little indent in there and another here, and that's where you start putting the caissons underwater from here to there and from there to there. And then you put the gates on top of that. The island itself actually is used as a control center. It's also used for recreation, by the way, that's part of the idea. But that's where all the control center of the whole thing operates. During construction, you would notice this in here, that's very typical. This is an emergency entrance. So if a boat gets caught outside in the middle of a storm and you close the gates, at least a small boat can actually go through a small lock into this refuge harbor right there and then come out. But that refuge harbor was used to build the caissons. So what you did is you built the caissons in the dry refuge harbor. You build this giant building, And then when ready to put them in place, you flooded that, the giant building floats, and you drag the giant building along, and then you sink them along from here to there, and from there to here. So that was a construction yard in Lido. And you see that it had also a protection, an outside protection breakwater that protects some for the winds from the south. This is Malamoco, the more complicated of all of them. Malamoco is where all the industrial traffic occurs. And at the beginning, the idea was that when a flood is coming, when a tidal is rising, you send a signal, hey, tankers, stay out there. Don't come in. You'll be out there for anything between 3 to 12 hours. The port said, no way. We don't buy this. You cannot do that. I think it's well, let me not go into that. But anyway, the end result was that the project was forced to design after the fact a lock for the big tankers. So in the middle of a storm, when you close off the inlet right in here, across here, a tanker can come in here, get into this protected harbor, go into that lock will change level, drop down, and the tanker can continue happily and merrily up to Marghera. That little modification cost about $300 million to do, which wasn't planned originally. So this is incredibly, I have to admit, I was like, you must be kidding me. Why are you doing this at this point in time? But it had to be done. I wanted to illustrate, these are the caissons. This is the size of the things. These are the caissons, largely the caissons that went into Malamoco and some into Lido South. To give you an idea, you see these ones the concrete is being poured in here, so this is a massive rebar jungle. And these are some of them completed. You see that they have the shape of the cradle where the gates sit. When each caisson is finishing here, remember the other ones in Lido were built in the refuge harbor and then floated out. In here, they created this artificial island here. This is just fill to build that. And it's quite a task because you have to make these things completely even. They cannot crack. And then you build them in here, and then you have to move them out. And to move them out, what you have is this neat machine, which reminds me of the Kennedy Space Center trawler that moves the rockets. It's a trawler, many of them together that work in coordination, that get under each of the things, pushes them up and carries them, and in a coordinated motion, slowly and carefully, they move the caisson to here. That is the biggest elevator I've ever seen in my life. And it's literally an elevator. You move the caisson into there, and the whole thing goes down underwater until the caisson floats. And then you move it to wherever it's going. And each of them is done in a particular order in order to empty this out. So this was, it was amazing to see this in operation, to say the least. This is Chioggia. This is the simplest and the smallest in width. It's not the smallest in depth. And again, Chioggia has a protecting barrier for winds from the south, which can get pretty tough. This is all new. All this is built. All this is reconstructed. And the barrier goes from here to there. And if you look at, this is the refuge harbor of Chioggia, and that's where the caissons were built. This is a gate. okay? There are about 70 of these things. The small is big and the big is very big. And again, everything had to be constructed to move the things and move them out. And including designing the vehicles that would move them out. Building them itself is not that difficult. This is marine construction. It's done by shipbuilders, the same way shipbuilders do, with cathode protection and all this stuff. And then painted with marine painting for the protection. So how would this work? This is an illustration of a simulated operation of the gates. And this was, if I recall correctly, I'm trying to remember the date, I think it's December 1st of 2008. And what you see, this is what it's intended to do. You would have a tide fluctuating, right? Notice that they go to about 80 and 90, but that is manageable by the passive protection. If you're in front of San Marco, also in front of the cathedral, when the tide reaches about 65 centimeters or 70 centimeters, you'll see water bubbling up, okay? So the cathedral area was also passively protected to protect it a little bit at a little bit higher level. So up to that, this can go up and down, you do nothing. It's passively protected. In here, they predict that this thing was going to be big. So the prediction is that it was going to be big, and then you close the gates. You order close. The gates are incredibly efficient in moving in and out. You can bring these things up and down in 20 minutes. To move the Rotterdam gates takes 6 hours. Give you a sense of it. That's important because you can make mistakes. You don't want to, you're predicting, right? You're telling, the minute you predict, you send a message to all the traffic, hold it. Slow down. We're going to close the gates. So you want something that can move fast. So that's done very efficiently. You make the prediction, you close the gates, and this line that you see here, that black line, is the level predicted that would have occurred when you had a flood of 155 centimeters that would have flooded all of Venice. But now it never went over 105. Or so, which kept everything dry. But then again, that's a simulation of that. I don't know if any of you are going to ask me, but maybe you can ask me later why this goes down and then goes up. But anyway, this is a simulation of several storms in 2009. This is the observed level in Venice and Malamocco. This is what it would have been without the barriers. This is what it is with the barriers. Again, protecting against all the floods. Anything above 110, everything was kept to 100 or less, right? Closure times from 2 hours to maybe 12 hours. That is very, very typical. So everything was going great. But, as you know, when things go great, things go bad. Construction started in 2003. This is sort of a chronology of when all the laws and all that. Construction started around this time in 2003 in here, and it was intended to be completed by the original plan by 2011. It got delayed. There was a 2-year delay that resulted because of the building a lock that wasn't in the plans, but mostly because at that point, Italy was really hurting financially, like everybody else. This was in the tail end of the 2008 recession, right? So financing took forever. The money was not flowing. Why do I say this? Remember, I'm going to tell you that things went really bad, okay? People bad, not engineering, not building bad, people bad. What enormous pressures. Where's the money? Where are we going to get the money? This thing is going on. So people were running like crazy trying to find the money, release the money from the state, and the state really and truly did not have the money. So there were delays for a while. And we thought, well, good, 2 years delay, I can live with that in many ways for a major infrastructure project. This is okay. By 2014, all the caissons, everything underwater, all the infrastructure was already done. The electronic controls were designed and procured. The project was over 90% completed. The difficulty was that in 2013 or so, an event occurred that sort of went initially, at least from me, somewhat unnoticed. The president of one of the major construction companies was arrested for trying to bribe and providing favors to the mayor of Kioya, the southernmost town. And when I first saw that, I said, his problem. That's right. And we stopped there. By 2014, the guy that was arrested decided that he wasn't going to go down quietly and started blaming all sorts of other people and accusing other people of doing all sorts of corrupt activities, largely paying off officials. By 2014, 35 people were arrested accused of corruption, including the mayor of Venice, including the president of the region, and including the president and director of CBN, of the company I work for. In 2015, the chief engineer was fired and arrested, and was, about a year later, she actually won a civil action, and they supposedly paid her I don't know how many millions of euros, because of all the craziness that was going on. She probably had very little to do anyway. She won the process, but she spent 3 months in jail. Message that I didn't miss in this, and I know these people very well. Of all these people, which were mostly men, the only one that ended up in jail was the woman. Okay? And now, the problem was I know her very well. They don't know who they were dealing with. She, of all the people that they could have tried to be tough with, they picked the wrong fight because she is tough. And she said, I'm going to fight you to the end, and she did. But anyway, at this point, everything stopped. Everything stopped. There was nothing going on. The project was 90% completed. The gates were underwater. Everything was there. But nothing was going on. What happened? Well, if you think of it, what went wrong? The financial crisis created what I think was a desperate environment where nobody knew where the next euro was coming from. And that resulted, since it depended on yearly orders or allocations from the government, it resulted deadlocking of the financing. The normal Italian bureaucracy, also under pressure, became a bigger obstacle than usual, giving rise to temptation and bribery to try to get things done. CBN large stockholders, the company, depended very much on the project by that time. Remember, we were in a global recession, leading to competition, power grabs, and misbehavior. Number 4, CBN really became too powerful. Number 5, the project with a price tag of north of $7 billion became the potential savior of all sorts of distressed players in a weak economy. Whatever the reason, the outcome honestly was catastrophic. Inherently good people lost their moral compass. A great project came to a standstill and deteriorated in place, adding enormous costs to an already expensive endeavor. This lasted from about 2014 to about 2017-18, when they fire everybody. They fire the memory of the system. Nobody knew that was left in CBN what on earth was going on. They were not capable of doing it. They finally went back and hired an extraordinary engineer that was the brainchild of a lot of this. And the whole thing started moving again. By 2020, they actually operated the gates. Those are the actual gates in operation. That's 2021, I'm sorry, but by 2020 they were in operation. This is Lido South in 2021 also. This is a picture of what actually some people try to do, but this is a picture of Venice that appeared in the press. And for those of you that have been in Venice, these are the sort of the things they put down so you could walk on water when it was flooded. No water when these gates were operating. The press that was a rabid critic of this project, and we can go why, a rabid critic of this project, all of a sudden says, the Moses is the name they give it, has saved the city 18 times. Now all of a sudden this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Since then, in this past year, the gates have been operated about 40 times, which is frankly far more than we expected. And there are reasons for that, but the city remained dry. The system worked. Like I said, the engineering worked, and as usual, the people failed. And that was the problem. Thank you very much.